The Jeffrey Epstein family estate made a fortune investing in the Trump-supporting AI company Palantir. The Epstein estate has made $130 million after Jeffrey Epstein's secret investment into Palantir.
I met Epstein a few times as well, and I think...
How'd you get introduced?
It was Reid Hoffman in Silicon Valley introduced us in 2014, but I went down all these rabbit holes. Was he, working for the Israelis or the Mossad or all this sort of stuff? And I've come to think that was very secondary. It was obviously it was just the U.S. If you're working for Israel, you don't get protected.
Now do you guys see why the Trump administration is doing their best to bury the Epstein story? Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, after years of spreading theories about what happened to Jeffrey Epstein, is now working for the Palantir-funded Trump administration, claiming that Epstein didn't kill himself.
You know a suicide when you see one, and that's what that was.
He killed himself. You want me to? I've seen the whole file. He killed himself.
Did Jeffrey Epstein hang himself, or did somebody kill him?
Senator, I believe he hung himself in a cell in the Metropolitan Detention Center.
As far as you know, he killed himself.
I'm telling you, he killed himself.
We are working through there is video. That is something the public does not.
There's video of him killing himself.
No, not the actual act, but the entire MCC Bay, it was only one camera. There's video that when you look at the video, and we will release, that's what's taken a while on this, we are working on cleaning it up to make sure you have an enhanced, and we're going to give the original so you don't think there were any shenanigans. The evidence we have in our files clearly indicates that it was, in fact, a suicide.
Then Donald Trump hired Pam Bondi, who was the Florida Attorney General, who refused to do anything about Jeffrey Epstein, despite the fact that his flight logs were made public and the fact that Jeffrey Epstein victims filed lawsuits. Why did Donald Trump hire someone who had a history of protecting Jeffrey Epstein? Now Pam Bondi is following the tradition of protecting Jeffrey Epstein by refusing to release the Epstein files. Now MAGA is in full-fledged cult mode after realizing that Donald Trump was the deep state globalist puppet the entire time.
The President of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
Well, thank you very much, Klaus, and hello to everyone in beautiful Davos.
Donald Trump proposed the North American Union, the merging of the United States, Canada, and the annexing of Greenland. He implemented digital ID and now building a database of Americans. Donald Trump is the biggest globalist of all time who is actively working to build a technocratic fascist state. Everyone in MAGA who fell for this fraud should be deeply embarrassed. Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel openly admits once again to arming and supporting an ISIS-affiliated militia. Netanyahu explained how they are arming ISIS-affiliated groups in Gaza in order to fight against Hamas. If the Western corporate news wasn't completely controlled by the Zionist mob, this would be a gigantic scandal. Whatever happened to the Hamas is ISIS and the ISIS is Hamas narrative? It was all projection. ISIS is a Western asset filled with Mossad members who are trained and armed by the United States in order to support the geopolitical objectives of the United States. Why do you guys think ISIS never attacked Israel? So you're telling me that while Israel carries out a genocide against a large Muslim population, ISIS is spending their time fighting against Hamas in Gaza? So while Israel is carrying out a genocide of the Palestinians, instead of joining the resistance to oppose the genocidal Zionist entity, ISIS instead overthrows Assad in Syria, who was supporting the resistance. So not only does ISIS refuse to attack Israel, they are constantly helping out Israel geopolitically. Meanwhile, there are still a lot of bootlickers in the West who refuse to admit this, even though we had Donald Trump, who openly admitted that Barack Obama funded and armed ISIS.
President Obama. He is the founder of ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS, okay? He's the founder. He founded ISIS.
So with the additional steps I ordered last month, we're speeding up training of ISIL forces. We're speeding up training of ISIL forces.
Benjamin Netanyahu is outright admitting that they arm ISIS. Meanwhile, a ton of people in the West refuse to admit it. This is just another example of how Zionism is the #1 sponsor and supporter of terrorism in the world. Zionism is a sick, twisted ideology. What's poppin', my friends? Family, welcome to another great edition of RBN Live. We have a Saturday show for you. And we also have a very special guest. Sam Husseini will be joining us. You guys know I'm always in the lab cooking with our hotspots. Make sure you guys follow and support us at hotspot on X. And I've been covering this very intensively. This is something the corporate media will never acknowledge, that you have ISIS. And this is why I was definitely going to cover this story, because it's just another example. These stories happen all the time, like all the time. Just like Israel openly admitted to funding Al-Qaeda units in Syria, which is, I still think is very depressing that there was people who still cheer the downfall of Assad now that, and after Israel admitted they funded these radical militants, and as they're like Syrians that are attacking Israel that is illegally occupying their country, and the Syrian government, HTS, they condemned the Syrians who was resisting the Zionist entity occupying them. You guys see the problem? You guys see how terrorist organizations like ISIS, these Muslim Zionists, they benefit Israel more than anything. Because imagine there's a genocide of Palestinians, imagine there's a famine, but these are the people who taken a buyout from Israel in order to fight Hamas, in order to attack Hamas. ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they was literally attacking Hamas members after October 7th. So in the time after October 7th, while Israel was weakened, they don't come together and attack Israel in their time of being weakened. No, they start attacking Hamas. Meanwhile, if you mention how ISIS is literally a tool of the Zionist regime, you get labeled conspiracy theories. They'll call you also anti-Semitic, but it's like an open fucking secret. Hamas never attacking Israel. Then you had this clip. Once again, you guys see Hotspot. We always providing the sources of information. I'm gonna play this clip. Then I'm gonna introduce Sam, our guest for today. But let me play this clip and then I'll move on because I want to get Sam in here.
Others. You tell the story about how you tried to find out what they call the Mossad when they deal with publicly?
I thought it was a reasonable question, but the trouble is you can't pick up the phone book. There's no Langley in Israel that you can look up, CIA, or in our case, the Mossad. We thought we should ask, what shall we call it in English? You can translate the Hebrew words, as I said, Mossad is institute, but when they write a letter to their friends in the CIA or the British intelligence, what do they call themselves? It took a while. It was a matter of asking the Prime Minister's spokesman. The best you could do, because officially the Mossad is under the Prime Minister's office. And I think he sort of wondered why you want to know and all that, so we explained. And he came up with the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. I mean, if it were to have initials, it would be ISIS. Just simple words like that. Interestingly enough, kind of a British model. The British don't really like the names MI5 and MI6 for their foreign service. They prefer SIS, Secret Intelligence Service.
What was the toughest bit of information to gather for this book?
I think about the extent, the involvement of the Israeli intelligence in a topic.
Isn't that interesting, guys? I think I can end it there. I think that says enough. This is out in the open knowledge, which will get you banned or arrested, like our guest Sam Husseini, who was arrested for doing journalism, calling out the Biden administration for genocide. So I'm going to use that as a transition to introduce our guest here. We have acclaimed journalist. We were big supporters of Sam Husseini. We did a lot of coverage of you calling out the Biden administration for the genocide. So it's great to finally have you on RBN. Thank you for joining us once again, Sam Husseini.
Good to be with you, Nick.
Absolutely. You were just at the UN, and we saw, once again, what you call, I think this is brilliant, what you call this the real Nazi salute. So once again, the U.S. is vetoing ceasefire resolutions, the same way that the United States is threatening European countries for floating the idea of a Palestinian state. So much for the Trump-Netanyahu breakup, right? So, Sam, there's a lot going on in the UN right now. Europe is making a lot of threats to Israel, which I think, anyway, I chime in a little bit later about that, those quote-unquote threats. But what have you seen from the UN? I would love to get your perspective since you've been covering this on the ground. What kind of pressure is Israel facing right now at the UN?
I'm sorry, what did you say at the end there?
What kind of pressure is Israel facing right now in the UN, and what was that U.S. veto vote all about?
Yeah, well, what we saw last week was a very mild resolution put forward in the Security Council. You know, the Security Council has the 5 permanent members and 10 elected members, and the 10 elected members who were on there just for, like 2-year stints got together and put together a resolution. That was a very, very mild resolution. It didn't even make any explicit mention of the orders from the International Court of Justice, coming from the South Africa genocide case against Israel. It just called for a ceasefire and for aid under UN mandate getting into Gaza. It was the mildest resolution you could possibly reasonably put forward. It even blessed the U.S. so-called negotiating process, because the U.S. allegedly, along with Qatar and Egypt, are doing these so-called negotiations between Israel and Hamas. It even said, grateful for this effort. So it was obsequious to the United States, and the U.S. government still vetoed it. And, in the most ridiculous fashion, talking about how the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that they've set up, this totally ridiculous thing that lures Palestinians into, that starves them, moves them around, then lures them into a certain area to allegedly get aid, and then they open fire on them. That's what they're depicting as the solution for what's being done to the Palestinians. So they vetoed it. It was 14 to 1. That's how that went down. Even Britain and France voted for this very mild resolution. Now, this is the 5th time since October 2023 that the U.S. has vetoed a ceasefire resolution. And, people say that the U.S. government is complicit in Israel's genocide. I say no. The U.S. government is a full partner in this genocide, but much of the rest of the world is complicit in one way or another. And I think that we've got a world of like Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate wanted to wash his hands of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So everybody wants to get up there and say, no, please, Israel, stop. And they want to wash their hands of it, and they want to make a proclamation, but they don't do anything to actually try to stop them. So what I've been advocating is a legal mechanism called Uniting for Peace. So you can have, the General Assembly, which has almost 200 members, basically the full United Nations, that they can grab hold of a situation when the Security Council, because of a member abusing its veto power, as the U.S. obviously has, and has failed to uphold international peace and security, which is the core mandate of the Security Council, that the General Assembly needs to step in. And this has actually been done to very good effect in the past. In the 1980s, when the United States was vetoing any attempts to deal with the apartheid government of South Africa and its occupation of Namibia, for example, the U.S. would veto that, and eventually the General Assembly got together, the African states, and a vast global majority they passed a resolution in 1981 denouncing the U.S. veto and calling for broad and mandatory sanctions on South Africa. And that was really the beginning of the end of the South African regime, because once you had the General Assembly calling for sanctions that really helped the student movements and other movements in the U.S. and around the world to really put the screws on and to ultimately force the collapse of that regime. Another amazing example of how Uniting for Peace was used was in 1956. You had Nasser in Egypt, a big Arab nationalist figure, trying to unite the Arab world, basically, and was immensely popular in the Arab world. In 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal. The British had controlled the Suez Canal. He says, this is Egyptian. It's high time we take it. He nationalized it. Then you had Britain and France, the two powers, the colonial powers that had carved up the Middle East among themselves after the First World War, teaming up with Israel and invaded Egypt to take the Suez Canal for themselves. They actually they took Gaza too. They took Gaza and they took the Sinai and they tried to get the canal. This was when Eisenhower was president. And Eisenhower says, hell no, you're not going to do this. And they couldn't do anything to stop this, of course, at the Security Council, because Britain and France, they got a veto there. They're two of the 5 countries with veto power. It's Britain, France, Russia, China, and of course the US. So what they do, they use Uniting for Peace. Eisenhower teams up with the Soviet Union to pass a Uniting for Peace resolution. This was the first use of UN peacekeeping troops, and they got peacekeeping troops on the ground there, and they forced the British and the French out of Sinai, let Nasser have the Suez Canal, and then Israel actually tried for about 6 months to hold on to Gaza. They eventually left the following year in 1957. So, those are 2 concrete examples of what should be happening. So if people look at stuff in the UN and you hear members like, whatever, Algeria or Slovenia or Denmark or, whoever, making what sound like good statements, but they're not taking it to the next level. They're not really putting their shoulder to the wheel and using the mechanisms that they have available. Now, I just learned yesterday that there's going to be some kind of meeting at the General Assembly this coming Thursday. And there's apparently a resolution drafted by Spain that's going to address some of these things. But I don't know if it's going to have teeth. There's a number of things that the UN General Assembly could do. They could call for mandatory sanctions. They could certainly call for an arms embargo. They could suspend Israel from the General Assembly, which was done to apartheid South Africa in 1974. The US and Britain and France were blocking anything being done about apartheid South Africa. One of the first steps that the majority of the General Assembly took in the 1970s was to at least suspend South Africa from the General Assembly. And they could call for a peacekeeping force to be moved in there. You got these people, individuals, including now high-profile people like, Greta Thunberg on these peace flotilla, these freedom flotilla boats. They're going in there, and that's great, but Israel has killed people in the past trying to do this stuff. So why is it left to this, handful of individuals, to try to do this heroic action? Why the hell aren't, Turkey and Brazil and
Lindsey Graham is like cheering, and many Zionists are cheering for Greta to be killed.
Kill her.
I call it the genocidal psychosis of the West. Where like you guys see how they just straight up devalue lives, and that's the byproduct of Zionism, is the devaluing of human lives. oh, Greta is a political nuisance. That's all that she's being, a political nuisance to the Zionist regime. Their response is kill her. That's crazy.
Right. Yeah. She's showing the unforgivable crime of treating, people of color and Palestinians' lives as valuable. So there's something wrong with her. So, throw her under the bus. So yeah, I think
you see this on that topic. I saw this earlier. I decided to show it right now because I saw this right before we went live. I'm like, bro, this is so batshit crazy. You guys understand that everything they tell you about Palestinians is true of Israel. I'll make this a little bit bigger. I don't even want to watch it. Like, I haven't watched the video, but they have these Israeli children that's going on this boat ride to quote unquote counter Greta Thunberg. So they have children for genocide in Israel. So the point I was about to make is, you guys know how literally everything, I'm not saying they are above criticism, but literally everything they tell you about Hamas is a projection from Israel. Everything. So what they tell you in order to convince you that it's okay to murder children, they tell you stuff like, don't you know that Palestinian children are brainwashed from an early age to hate and kill Jews? That is Zionist children. I'm not bullshitting. They are literally taught from a young age to hate Palestinian children. They are taught from a young age that they serve no other purpose other than being propaganda props for the Zionist regime, like they're doing here. I don't want to play the video. Do you guys want to see it? I don't really care about seeing it. But you guys see how they use children? Sam, you have any thoughts before I move on?
Yeah, no, Israel is a highly, highly racist and indoctrinated society, and it's a big problem that really needs to be addressed. And I think you're absolutely right about the whole projection thing. Every accusation is a confession to Israel. Every time that they scream that Hamas or the Palestinians are doing something, and I think you're right, Hamas shouldn't be above criticism. But the criticisms that Israel and the U.S. establishment continuously spout, it's actually they're projecting their own criminality, their own bloodthirst, their own viciousness and supremacy.
Yeah, there's so many things you said in your analysis in the UN. I'm still backtracking on a lot you said. It was a great analysis. I'm glad you brought that information. But one thing you mentioned, how you are upset at the institutions. I have mentioned how I believe one of the biggest losers of the genocide was the UN and the concept of international law that was shown to be fraudulent. You can bypass it with might makes right. You know what I mean? But there's an overall failing of institutions. And it's very sad because I'm a big lover of combat sports and I love international soccer. I'm a big fan of Champions League soccer. I'm a big fan of the World Cup. But I literally have not been able to watch it, guys. It literally disgusts me because they allow Israeli football players to play. And by the way, in order to be on the Israeli football team, you have to serve in the IDF. So I'm not just picking on random Israeli. These are all IDF war criminals that FIFA and I'm sad because I haven't watched this shit in like 2-3 years, guys. I love international soccer. I watched the age of Messi and Ronaldo. Like I was eating good for years. I legitimately lost all interest. Like not like like the racism, that the normalization of genocide. Meanwhile, they banned Russia. So what does that say? They banned Russia from competing in FIFA. I wouldn't even be that mad, honestly, if they had we won't ban anyone. But they banned Russia from competing in international football matches while allowing Israel to compete, sending an international message that Palestinian lives doesn't matter. It literally makes me so sick to the stomach. I can't really enjoy the sport no more. But that's a side point. The whole point I'm making is about the failure of the institutions. And I want you to maybe speak more about that because you mentioned that during your opening monologue. Do you want to speak more about how you were disappointed with how the international community, and I agree, failed the Palestinians?
Yeah, well, they clearly have, but we have to get into the specifics to try to fix this damn thing. I mean, I've been meeting, with some of these delegations, and the European ones are especially infuriating because Europe has put at least 19 sanctions on Russia since 2022. It's hard to get them to do any minor sanctions on Israel. So it's ridiculous, the level of duplicity there. I mean, my problem though has been, I and a bunch of other people pushed for a country to invoke the Genocide Convention against Israel in 2023. I actually first wrote about this back in 2014 when Israel was attacking Gaza big time then. I think that was called Operation Cast Lead. Because back then even you had countries start saying this is starting to look like genocide. So I was like, well, put your money where your mouth is. There's a remarkable law professor, Francis Boyle. He was the first person to advocate doing this. He died early this year. And then you had Michael Ratner of the Center for Constitutional Rights basically back him up back in 2014. So I started writing about this then. And then after, October 2023, then I said, okay, this is, really got to get done. So I wrote a bunch of articles saying all these countries are calling what Israel's doing genocide. Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Jordan, Pakistan, all these countries, but none of them are invoking the Genocide Convention. What the hell? And I kept writing about it and trying to get people and former Nobel Peace Prize winners to be calling up these governments to get them to do something. And of course, South Africa finally did, thank God, in late 2020, like on December 29th, 2023. Yeah. They invoked the Genocide Convention, and that was excellent. And then they had a series of hearings, and the International Court of Justice issued some emergency orders. They still haven't taken on the case in full. That's going to take a couple of years. But they did issue some emergency orders telling Israel, for example, to make sure that all aid went in, and so on. And then finally, in May of 2024, so a year ago, they issued a very direct order because South Africa back then kept going back for more orders. And they said, you, Israel, are attacking Rafah. You must immediately stop your attack of Rafah. It was no ifs, ands, or buts, because the previous emergency orders, people were saying, oh, there's some ambiguity to it and blah, 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 blah. The May 24th order, there was no ambiguity. You're attacking Rafah. You began attacking Rafah on May 7th. You must immediately stop. Now, a properly functioning system, when a court issues an order like that, a court issues an order, and then the sheriff is supposed to enact it. In this case, the sheriff is supposed to be the UN Security Council. So Algeria, which is the only Arab member of the Security Council, started drafting a resolution to implement that ICJ order, which is what should happen in a normally functioning system. The US stalls this for a week, and then Biden gets up there and says, Netanyahu has agreed to a ceasefire. So we're going to make the ceasefire happen and hip, hip, hooray. Then you start seeing statements by the Israelis saying, no, not so much.
Yeah, I remember that.
So it's all this, bullshit, excuse my French, from, Biden and Blinken and so on. And then the US manages to pull together this so-called UN Security Council resolution blessing their negotiations for a ceasefire. The resolution made no mention whatsoever of the International Court of Justice orders. And this wasn't an advisory opinion. The International Court of Justice has also done advisory opinions, which are important, but they weren't orders. The May 24th move by the International Court of Justice was a direct order. And Algeria and all these other countries vote for this, piece of crap. And I was incensed, and I was writing about it, and I was screaming about it, and what the hell? So, I mean, when people say international law is a joke, you have to figure out how to use international law. I mean, it's like saying armed struggle is a joke. Yeah, I mean, if somebody takes a pin out of a grenade and then throws the pin and holds onto the grenade and it blows up in their hand, you don't necessarily say armed struggle is a joke. No, you got to learn how to goddamn use armed struggle if you're going to go down that road.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, know how to use your tools. Okay. Now, you don't get an order from the International Court of Justice and then not force a vote on it. And if the U.S. wants to veto it, then let them veto it and let them be shown in front of the whole damn world as to what a bunch of lawless criminals they are, and then go to the General Assembly and try to override it. But you don't just sit there, as the Algerians and as did all these other countries. The only country that didn't vote for it was Russia. They abstained because they saw that it was a complete joke and a complete farce. You know, and all these other countries, when they were voting for this U.S. resolution that made no mention of the International Court of Justice, they actually would talk about the International Court of Justice orders, but they weren't in the resolution that they were voting for.
Yeah.
And the Russians called them out. You know, you got to give them credit where you got to give them credit. They were like, this is a baloney resolution. They could have vetoed it. They could have vetoed it. They didn't veto it. They claimed, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, later said that the Arab group asked him not to veto it. I don't know what the story is, but he claimed that at one point. So that's a lot. And so Biden says we're working on a ceasefire process, and they dragged it out for the rest of Biden's term. And this really shows how orchestrated this whole thing was, because they finally got the ceasefire in 4 days before Biden was to leave office. That's when Blinken had his last news conference, and when they dragged me out of the news conference. And then Trump comes in pretending to be a great peacemaker, right? You know, I'm Mr. Peace. Right. I'm Donald Trump. Doesn't everybody love me? And then they very quietly, and that got Gaza completely off the front pages. And the story then became Donald Trump and his daily antics. And they quietly put the screws on to prevent any aid from coming in March. And then at the beginning of March, and then by the middle of March, they totally blew up that ceasefire deal. The Israelis did. And this got minimum media scrutiny, so they got to dramatically escalate their genocide while minimizing the coverage of it, the way that they orchestrated it. It's brilliant. It was brilliant. You got to hand it to them.
Yeah, the way that genocide Joe Biden was the raw architect of the genocide is understated. Because the way our great revolutionary Glenn Ford said, the Democratic Party is the most effective evil.
Correct.
And they decided to engage in the final solution for Gaza when they had Joe Biden in charge, who is the most diehard Zionist that has been in the Senate over the last 2 decades. You can't you can say you're equal. You can say they're Lindsey Graham, but you can't become a more diehard Zionist than Joe Biden. It's not possible. So once they got Joe Biden in office, after investing in him in decades, cultivating his career for decades, that's when they engaged in the final solution. And the Biden administration did everything they possibly could in order to provide cover and facilitate the genocide. And they was able to help Israel slaughter a very large percentage of the Palestinian population because of their use of regulations, had to stop the UN. Like, they're so good at political decorum, for the lack of a better term. They're good at using the institutions as a way to implement their barbaric ideology, which kind of make me worried. And I want to get your thoughts about this, because we have seen the ruling class adjust and adapt after their losses. Like, for example, you mentioned South Africa and how the international community clamped down on them. I feel like the pro-apartheid ruling class saw that shit and they learned from it. Like, you know how we have theory on the left, we have Marxist theory, we have revolutionary theory. I explained this on RBN many times before. The same way that we have revolutionary theory, the ruling class has ruling class theory. Like, they have people like Madeleine Albright, people like Henry Kissinger, who Hillary Clinton openly said is her mentor. So they have mentors. You have people who successfully engage in genocide, successfully conquer nations, and then they pass down the knowledge to the next generation of the ruling class. The same way that whenever a generation of the ruling class suffers a brutal defeat, That's when they're like, okay, we gotta learn our lesson from that and make sure they're not repeated. And I want to hear your thoughts on this because we're seeing the Zionist ruling class study what happened with South Africa and learning from the mistakes with South Africa. We're seeing Biden manipulating the international rule of law to keep Israel freed up to commit their crimes. And now you have a coordinated attack by not only just Trump, because the liberal media, they will phrase this as just a Trump thing. But whenever you listen to MSNBC and CNN, whenever they talk about Trump's attacks on the UN, they will say, well, technically, Trump does has a point on some of these criticism, because you know that's why liberalism exists, in order to enable and justify the fascism that comes from the right. But it's a coordinated attack by the ruling class. That's why both Democrats and Republicans support the sanctioning the ICC by the Trump administration. I'm trying to find that receipt right now. I can't find it. I want to ask you about that. Between Trump escalating their sanctions attack on the ICC and Trump openly attacking the UN as an anti-Semitic body and offensively going after it, do you see the threat to international law? Because to me, I see the ruling class. If you are successful, Sam, I think they're just gonna light the rule book on fire. Like they learn from their mistakes. Do you have any thoughts? Do you have anything you want to add before I show you guys any more receipts?
Yeah, no, that to the extent that they want international institutions to exist, they want to instrumentalize them, so that they can have UN cover for when they invade Iraq or when they put sanctions on Russia. They want to use international law so that they can go before their own public and say, you know, what we're doing is totally legit here. But they don't actually, the last thing they actually want is actual law that actually applies equally to all parties and will scrutinize their own criminality as well as anybody else's. So we could end up going down a road where they will seek, as you say, to burn it down. If I understood you correctly, and you actually had, you had the visual of one of the Israeli ministers spoke at the UN last year, and he had a little copy of the UN Charter in a little paper shredder, and he shredded it. He said, "This is what you're doing. And I'm like, "No, you're doing it, and you're literally doing it, and you're accusing other people of doing it." That Israel is sort of the tip of the spear of the U.S. establishment, attempting to to totally dismantle international law and totally make it and you have parts of the establishment like Eric Prince, who's the founder of what used to be called Blackwater, which was instrumental in the invasion of Iraq and his weapons mercenary firm and all of that. He's outright calling for a new colonialism. We don't need to pretend with neocolonialism and corporatism anymore. Let's just go full hog and have a full blown new colonialism in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on. So I think that is an option, and they could be using that as a threat to other countries to say, you got to give us most of what we want through the UN, or we're going to burn it all down. That could well be part of their, if you want to call it negotiating or blackmail or, threatening posture towards the rest of the planet.
So this, once again, this is the bipartisan AIPAC, and liberals love AIPAC. This is the messaging that not just coming from the far right, guys. Like it's a coordinated attack by the ruling class in order to destroy the international law that is restraining their bloodthirsty ruling class members. Because I think they look at the previous generations of the ruling class. They see the Geneva Conventions, and they're like, "What the fuck would you guys doing?"
Right.
But I mean, I get the strategy, but obviously we know they weaponize that kind of stuff. But they're like, why would we even agree to this fucking shit? It's to the current generation of the ruling class. It's absurd that they will ever show any sort of restraint. You know what I mean? You can make the argument. I guess this is me being very loose with the previous generations, but you can say that they was legitimately traumatized after tens of millions of people who died, and they was like, maybe I'm being pretty naive there, but you can see them like, all right, man, we got to put some fucking rules on the book. But the current generation of the ruling class, they think that's ridiculous.
Right.
And you go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's because they think that they got a united West, right? NATO gives them a united Europe and United States. So, I mean, they set up the Geneva Convention and everything because, you had wars between, France and Britain and Germany, So once when the European powers started fighting each other, they decided, okay, we got to have rules. But now, if they're not going to be fighting each other, and if they're unified against, other people around the world, then they can decide what you're saying. Well, maybe we don't need the rules anymore, and we can just, have at it and throw out the rule book. And that is, one of my big questions to Miller, and I reiterated it, to Blinken, was, do you recognize the Geneva Conventions as applying to the Palestinians?
Yeah.
And the Biden people, now I haven't had a chance to ask this. I'm back in, they're letting me back in. They're not calling on me, or I've only gotten one question in under Trump. So Trump might just say, yeah, hell with the Geneva Conventions. But under Biden, I had several go-arounds with them about it, and they would never say, we do not recognize the Geneva Conventions. They would evade or, deceitfully respond to it. But if you really look at it closely, it's clearly their policy to say, we will not recognize it. And actually, sometimes when you ask them that question, this is a really, it shows how they lie. When I asked them, do you recognize the Geneva Conventions? One time they said, we recognize Israel has the right to defend itself.
Yeah.
Which you hear all the time, but really think about what that says, because when you're talking about, obviously Israel, it's a state, it has a right to defend itself from Syria or Lebanon or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or whoever, but it's occupying the Palestinian people. And under that set of circumstances, Israel does not have a right to defend itself. Under international law, it has a right to maintain order as an occupying power. When Germany was occupying France during World War II, it did not have a right to defend itself. Under the Geneva Conventions, if you're an occupying power, you do not have a right to defend yourself from the people that you're occupying. So in effect, what they are saying, and what everybody who says Israel has a right to defend itself, whether they're aware of it or not, they're parroting a statement that in effect says the Geneva Conventions do not apply to Israel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm not an international scholar, but I read a little bit, and the entire idea, I could even make a legal argument that Yemen is in the right. I think.
Yeah.
I can make an argument that if any Arab nation attacked Israel, they would be in the right, because the creation of Israel was contingent on the creation of the Palestinian state. So as long as Israel blocks the creation of the Palestinian state, they are out of compliance with the UN. Okay, that's not enough, right? What about when you engage in genocide?
Correct.
So when you engage in genocide, everyone who's a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, they have an obligation.
And the Genocide Convention. Yeah.
They have an obligation to do everything they can to stop the genocide, like Yemen engaged in a blockade. So in that sense,
correct.
That just show how that's the main argument that we got to use, and that's what I always hammer Zionists with. We gotta hammer them with the fact that Israel is inherently out of compliance with international law, because they're blocking the creation of Palestine. Anyway, I'm ranting now. I have two more quick presentations. We'll wrap up around an hour. You did a lot of great contribution. I'm enjoying this conversation. Big shout out to friends. So you guys know Landry. I appreciate your generous super chat. I hope you guys enjoying this Saturday 1 hour foreign policy power hour we're doing. It's great to finally have Sam on here because we cover a lot of these questions that you was asking Matthew Miller and these psychopaths. We definitely be covering. I just have 2 quick presentations I'll do, and then we'll begin to wrap up. I want to ask you about the 2-state solution. What's going on with that? Because there's a lot of legitimate debate about whether October 7th was worth it. And I think that's 100% legitimate because the how much the Palestinian people have suffered. But there is one fact, though, that I will just put out there. And I'm not arguing for or against it. This is something I want to put out there. Before October 7th, the amount of European countries and international support for a 2-state solution was non-existent. That shit might as well have been dead. Then October 7th happened, the active resistance happened, and the 2-state solution is now on the table where a lot of people are coming out in support of this. You guys have to remember, though, a lot of these European leaders, and I want your perspective, you can put back on me on this if you disagree. I feel like a lot of these leaders are full of shit. And the reason why they're doing this is because of the massive public sentiment that is now against Israel. So you have these leaders who are struggling politically. You have a rise of people in Europe who are now, to be clear, the world has always been for a free Palestine. The United States has been behind, but now it's worse than it's ever been with the European youth being 100%, they've 100% woken up about the Zionist regime. Like I saw a poll in Japan, like bro, Japan is extremely anti-Zionist. I don't remember the number on top of my head, so I don't want to quote it. But Japan is one of the most anti-Zionist countries in the world now, and you guys know how close they are to the United States. Just to illustrate how bad it is worldwide. So I'm going to read this headline. And this is why the world leaders are calling out Israel. This is my thought. Because if the populace was okay with Israel genocide, if there wasn't protests, do you guys really think Emmanuel Macron would be saying anything right now? Do you guys really believe any of these European leaders would be saying right now, if it wasn't for the people power? Which is why, as a revolutionary, that's what I always want to stress. This wouldn't even be a conversation that we are having right now if Europeans wasn't turning against Zionism. So never let the ruling class disempower you. But let me read a headline for people who are only listening, don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Here's the headline. Amid Gaza outrage, Europe reaches a turning point on Israel. And this is what I mentioned earlier as well. This is WikiLeaks. And I'm gonna ask you about this shift against Israel in Europe and whether you're seeing it. But I'm going to read this poll here. Support for Israel has collapsed across Western Europe. Spain, the government of Spain called for arms embargo. You said they minus 55. Denmark minus 54. Italy 52. France 48. UK minus 46. Germany minus 40. Look, guys, these are horrific numbers for the state of Israel. That's my presentation. But you guys see the two things I want to ask you is: are you seeing this decrease in support of Israel and what you're reacting to it? And I want you to discuss this conversation going on at the UN about a 2-state solution and what your thoughts about that. Any thoughts, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's going to be a summit at the UN at the middle of this month. I think the 17th to the 20th. On a 2-state solution. I'm very wary of this particular summit because in part because it's sponsored by the French, who still haven't recognized a Palestinian state, and the Saudis, who could have a great deal of influence and use their power for good, but they're constantly playing footsie with the United States, and they have their own economic interests and so on, obviously. So I feel like they are using this as a way of pretending that they're doing something, and I think a lot of other countries are going to latch on to it in that way. When the U.S. vetoed just this week, some countries made statements, and for example, Pakistan, in their statement, they actually used the word genocide, which was good, but they actually said we look forward to the French and Saudi summit, which it is probably, to talk about a 2-state solution now in the face of a genocide seems, paltry at best.
Yeah.
You should have wrapped up the two-state stuff 10, 20 years ago at the latest. And if they are going to do this, then they should do it for real and talk about the real legacy of international law in Israel. So, for example, the right of return for refugees, and reparations, and all of these other things that would come with a meaningful two-state solution. Now, that could. I'm not precluding a one-state solution. So I'm very wary of this upcoming thing on the 17th. But I want to emphasize what I said earlier. This coming week on the 12th is going to be a General Assembly meeting. And that poses far more substantial opportunities if it's used right. If you can have the General Assembly doing things with teeth, sanctions, arms embargo, suspending Israel, peace force. Those are things that could be done through the General Assembly. Some of those things could actually be done through this two-state solution thing, but because it's France and Saudi Arabia obviously has its own crimes in Yemen and elsewhere. So I'm very wary of that.
Yeah. I want to share this as well. And you mentioned
I should go after this.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll wrap up. We'll wrap up after this. The two-state solution, I would never undermine the attempt to establish a two-state solution. I would never undermine it. I just don't trust Israel to not attack Palestine. Like, you guys see how psychotic Israel is? Like, I don't trust Israel not to constantly attack Palestine, even if we had a two-state solution. Just one of many reasons why I'm opposed to it. But I believe in a one-state solution, but I'm not going to undercut like the Palestinians who asked for a two-state solution. I think it's upon us, especially as Americans, to take the left position of many Palestinians. We should take the radical position in order to provide cover for them, because many Palestinians can't even advocate for a one-state solution or they will be killed, labeled as a terrorist. But anyway, let me move on. I know you're short on time. I'm gonna just quickly read this headline to show you guys why you was right to be skeptical, because in the beginning you said you were skeptical about this. So once again, the reason why I mentioned people power is because the reason why they're saying this stuff, because there is massive pressure on France. There are people in the street in France calling for France to sanction Israel. So Emmanuel Macron has to bullshit. So the reality of the situation is, your instinct is correct, Sam. I think this conference is bullshit. Look at this headline. Conference to recognize Palestinian state to weaken scope of its ambition, diplomats say. But anyway, last thing I want to share you, and I want to get your thoughts on this lastly, and then we wrap up. I'm not going to play the video, but we covered how you was arrested by the genocidal Biden administration. I have to get your thoughts. I just have to get your thoughts on this. We can use this as kind of your closing statements in a way. Where Matthew Miller, and we played this video before, I already covered the story. I just have to hear your thoughts on this. Now he's just openly admitting that, yeah, I believe that there was a genocide. I was just doing my job as someone who represents the U.S. government, because he's still a young guy. Like, there's no statute of limitations on genocide. So Matthew Miller is now testing out that I was just following orders defense. So anyway, I'll spare you guys my take on this. I already did. Sam, any take on Matthew Miller and any insights you have regarding covering the Biden administration? I enjoyed this conversation. We can end it after your final thoughts here.
Yeah, I've tremendously enjoyed this conversation. Nick, I just got to head out soon. I mean, Patel, his assistant, I think got a gig at a firm that is a registered lobbyist for Israel. It's something that a lot of people didn't notice, which I thought was hilarious. And he's got a gig with some consultancy firm now. Miller does. In his statement, I thought, he's actually, it sounds like a mea culpa, but it's not. I mean, he's still dissembling and deceiving. Absolutely. He certainly didn't say that that they're committing genocide or anything like that. He said there may have been individual war crimes, that is, renegade soldiers, but he characterized it as if it was not a chronic thing from the top down. So I think it was ridiculous, bogus attempt to try to try to make himself look decent and wash his hands of the situation. I mean, he did so many things while he was there, because he was making the argument that, it's not my job to give my opinion. It's my job to represent the views of the State Department. But I mean, he did far beyond that. I mean, for example, just to take one small example, I asked him if he knew about the Hannibal Directive, where Israel kills its own people and potentially U.S. citizens, who are in the hands of a Palestinian group because they don't want to negotiate. Right? I mean, I'm sure your listeners know about the Hannibal Directive. And the reason for the Hannibal Directive is that Israel never wants to negotiate in good faith. So if a Palestinian group gets hold of Israelis or other foreign nationals, Israel wants to kill them so that they don't have to negotiate in good faith. So I actually raised this at one of the briefings. I said, is it possible that Israel is going to use the Hannibal Directive against U.S.? This was when Israel still had living, U.S. people in its custody. And he said, I have no knowledge of that alleged directive. And I kept trying to follow up. You've never heard of the Hannibal Directive? And then he goes to one of his favorite journalists and, goes on another topic. So that's just an outright lie. It's not that he was advocating the State Department views rather than his own. He just pretended not to know about something that he obviously knows about. So no, he's just a plain old genocidal liar and always will be.
Yeah. I greatly enjoyed the work of the Bible. We covered it a lot of time on RBN. Your journalism, calling these people out to their face, is not only a service to humanity, it is content gold. Like 100%. But anyway, I'm glad that we had the conversation. It's great to hear from you. Make sure you guys check out Sam Husseini. Thank you guys for watching us. This is RBN Saturday 1 hour foreign policy hour. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure you guys check out my live stream I did on Thursday covering Epstein, the whole Elon Trump Epstein thing. It's a mess, but there's a lot of there, and I covered a lot of that on Thursday. So make sure you guys check that out. Once again, make sure you guys follow Sam Husseini and check out the Sabian JB show. They had a great show on Thursday as well. Make sure you guys check that out. We had a double header on Thursday, so make sure you guys check out all those streams. Thank you again, once again, Sam. Like and share the stream. Have a good weekend, my friends. Take care.
Thank you so much. You too.